Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Rajan Verdian and I'm the Superintendent President of Pasadena City College. And it is my honor to welcome Mr. Tim Wise back to Pasadena City College. Mr. Wise is one of the most prominent anti-racist writers and activists in the United States today. And it is our great pleasure to have him here with us. All you need to do is look around you in this room to understand the diversity that makes up PCC's community. More than 75% of our student body comes from minority groups. And our faculty and staff are increasingly a reflection of that diversity. Beyond race and ethnicity, our campus community represents a wealth of different perspectives in income level, gender expression, veteran status, and other areas. Through celebrating this difference, we are all made stronger. Last week, I had the opportunity to make a few remarks at the event celebrating James Baldwin and the showing of Raoul Peck's documentary, I Am Not Your Negro. I ended my remarks with a quote from James Baldwin, whom I admire very much, and in fact, I even wrote a master's thesis on James Baldwin in 1975. And in that thesis, I addressed the issues of racism, equality, and sexual identity in James Baldwin's work. James Baldwin wrote, and I quote, "It is certain that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." I am certain Mr. Wise will directly or indirectly touch on this theme in tonight's talk, uprooting racism, privilege, and institutional inequity, as he addresses questions of difference and equity at the local, state, and national levels. He is uniquely qualified to do so. Mr. Wise has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states on over 1,000 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the nation. In addition, he is the author of 7 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority, and White Lives Matter, Race, Crime, and the Politics of Fear. He has also contributed chapters or essays to over 25 additional books. Mr. Wise is also one of 5 people, including President Barack Obama, interviewed for a video exhibition on race relations in America featured at the new National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Mr. Wise attended Tulane University, where he served as a leader of the campus anti-apartheid movement, pressuring the school to divest its assets from U.S. companies that conducted any business with the South African government. He graduated in 1990 with a BA in political science and a minor in Latin American studies. Tonight's lecture is co-sponsored by the Social Sciences Division and Student Equity. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise back to Pasadena City College. Mr. Wise, thank you.
This is very impressive. Not me, you. This is really, I mean, I'm going to try to be impressive, but I make no promises. You guys, this is great. This is like several hundred people, or if I use the Donald Trump inauguration math, 100,000 people all jammed into one room at Pasadena City College. How the hell did you pull that off? It's like 100,000 people in here. It's amazing. It's the biggest turnout in the history of any speech ever given at Pasadena City Community College. other than the last one I gave, where there were 10 million of you in the room. Yeah, it's going to be that kind of night, so hang out. It is good to see that extra credit still counts for something in higher education. That's good shit. Yeah, you know. It's okay. I don't care. I don't care if you're here because these are the issues that you think about every day. I don't care if you're here because you're being academically bribed by some professor who said they would give you triple credit for coming here. Doesn't matter, because a couple things. Number one, the lights are on. They're up, and if you get up to leave, I'm totally going to see it, and it's tacky as hell, and I'm going to call it out. Secondly, you really couldn't get out of here if you tried right now, so without causing some kind of horrible scene or fire hazard. So really, just hang out with me for like an hour. It's an hour of your life you'll never get back, but I'll try to make it not too painful. Try to make it informative. Try to make it something you can walk away with some information that'll help as you move forward in this world. I find it interesting, you know, in the introduction there, the president mentioned James Baldwin, and I'm going to do that as well, because I, as well as he, have a great regard for Baldwin, and I think that sometimes, particularly for those of us who are white and do this work, it's really important for us, whenever possible, to point both backwards and forwards and next to us to those persons of color who have done so much of the hard and heavy lifting over the years when it comes to fighting white supremacy and racism. And Baldwin certainly did more than his share of that. And in particular, Baldwin was especially prescient and important in the way that he understood how the past affects the present and how our understanding of the past is critical in terms of our ability to understand where we are as a country right now, right? The idea that if you don't understand sort of what came before now, whether we're talking about our politics and the current administration, or whether we're just talking about any subject related to race, and I would actually go further and say any subject anywhere. If you don't understand what came before, you can't really make sense out of what you're seeing right now. He was especially critical of the way that white Americans often had this sort of hagiographic, horribly inaccurate understanding of our history and how it affected our ability to understand the world that we perceived. This is what he said over a half a century ago. Speaking of white folks, he said, "People who imagine that history flatters them, as it does indeed since they wrote it, are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world. This is where it appears most white Americans find themselves today, impaled. They are dimly or perhaps even vividly aware that the history they have fed themselves is mainly a lie, but they do not know how to be released from it, and they suffer enormously from the resulting personal incoherence." Now, first off, damn, that is such a brilliant statement that I could sort of be done. Like, if this mic were a droppable mic, I could just pick it up, drop it, walk out the door, and be like, I'm done. But they're paying me for a full hour, and I have more to say. But honest to God, like that one paragraph from James Baldwin, what is he saying, right? He's saying that people who have the luxury and the power to have written the history with no real understanding of what it was, right, can't even see themselves in the world, let alone understand the world that they find, and they actually suffer because of it. It's not only the suffering of those whom they denigrate and step upon, but even themselves, they become incomprehensible to themselves. You cannot understand what comes today if you don't understand what came before. And look, that's not just about race. It's true in your own life, isn't it? If you don't understand the dysfunctions, the pathologies, the messed upness, which is not really a word, but, you know, we all can relate to what it means, the messed upness of your own family. If I can't do that with my own family, then I can't understand my own damage, right? The damage that I don't want to pass on to my own children. If I want to be a better parent, I got to know where my parents screwed up, as well as understand what they did right? So whether it's good or bad, you got to know from whence you come. Right. The problem is we don't do that very often. And when we don't do it, we create a very dangerous world in terms of our ability to work together and build justice. Let's think about a few contemporary examples, right, to understand what I mean. And I'll talk a little bit about the election and political context in a minute, but I want to start somewhere else because I don't want to give this particular moment, this particular man, this particular administration any more credit for creating this problem than he deserves, because this thing has been around since long before Donald Trump. This thing has been around long before Trumpism, right? We can't give all the credit there. It's not like Donald Trump thought up some new stuff. Right? It's not like Donald Trump created the problem. This is a problem that goes back to the founding of our country. So we'll get to that. But I want to start somewhere else. If you don't understand, for instance, the history, the predicate, what came before, when it comes to the subject of law enforcement misconduct in black and brown communities, for instance, right? If you don't know that history because it was never taught to you, right, then a movement like Black Lives Matter won't make sense to you. If you don't understand the way that black life has been discounted and denigrated and has not mattered institutionally to an awful lot of folks, right, then somebody proclaiming that Black Lives Matter will seem irrational. It will seem horribly militant and separatist and maybe even hateful. And then you'll say things like, but what about my life? What about me? All lives matter, don't they? What about me? I know, precious. I know your life matters. I know my life. You don't have to tell me that all lives matter. I get that. I got 2 children. I got 2 teenagers. They're 15 and 13. They are white. That is what happens when white people make babies. You get white babies. They are white. I know that their lives matter. You don't have to tell me. I don't need a bumper sticker to remind me of the value of my own children's lives. The point is, every cop in this country also knows that my daughter's lives matter. And every teacher knows, and every employer knows, and every bank loan officer knows. That is to say, we don't have to specify about my daughters. Their lives and the value of their lives are taken for granted. You only got to specify that which gets routinely ignored. You only have to specify that which we tend to forget, because remember, white folks have a long history of saying all and not meaning it. We do. Thomas Jefferson, now, he's not representative of all white people, but I gather he's one of white people's favorite white people. Thomas Jefferson said, did he not, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's that word all, as in all lives matter, all men are created equal. But when Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he owned over 250 other human beings, so I'm guessing he didn't really mean it. But he said it, right? And when the Pledge of Allegiance was written, first iteration in the 1880s, there were several afterward through the 1920s, last iteration, last version, 1954. But in every iteration of the pledge, what's that last line? That never changed. With liberty and justice for whom? All. There's that word again, written by white folks who I dare say in 1888 or whatever it was, did not mean it. Nor did they mean it in the 20s, nor did they mean it in the 50s. So what black folks are trying to tell us with BLM, whether we're prepared to hear it or not, is that when y'all have been forgetting that we're part of the all, we're going to have to remind you. And Black Lives Matter becomes that asterisk at the end of white folks all. As in, yeah, y'all need to be reminded from time to time that you've been forgetting some folks. Now, we can certainly make the argument that we got to be clear that indigenous lives matter and Latinx lives matter and Asian Pacific Islander lives matter, because those are too often discounted as well. But trust me when I tell you that in this country, when black lives finally do matter, at the institutional and systemic level, all of our lives will, and not one moment before that, see? But if you don't know the history of misconduct, nothing I said will make sense to you, because for a lot of white folks, we have grown up in a society where the police really were the protectors. We just had a different relationship to law enforcement than a lot of people of color have. This isn't about bad cops, good cops, by the way. It's not about, oh, all police are terrible, all police are racist, all police are brutal. It's not about people, it's about systems, right? And law enforcement as a culture has a history of abuse, and every Angelino who is black and brown knows that. Everyone in this greater area who is black and brown knows that. Everybody's been in Pasadena long enough knows that, right? Black folks, for instance, know that modern policing traces directly to slave patrols. That's the first iteration of policing in this country, right? And there's a bright line relationship between that and what came next. Cops were the ones who enforced the slave laws. Cops were the ones who enforced segregation. Cops were the ones who collaborated with riots in black neighborhoods, burning them to the ground in the 20s and 30s. Cops were the ones who collaborated with military uniformed officers in Los Angeles in 43 during the Zoot Suit riots when they rampaged in Chicano neighborhoods. And Chicano folks in this area know that history. A lot of white folks weren't taught it. And you can't know what you weren't taught, and you can't teach what you don't know. So I'm not saying you ought to feel bad for not knowing it. I'm just saying when you don't know some stuff, you miss some stuff. When you have the luxury of being oblivious to that history, you miss some stuff. People of color don't have the same luxury. They know that it was cops that pulled protesters off of the stools during the sit-ins in the South where I'm from. That wasn't done by random folk off the street. That was cops with guns and badges and the power of the state. See, here's the problem. Whether you're a good person or a bad person, and you become a police officer, I think most people who become cops, most people who become teachers, most people who become whatever they become are good people. I think most people are good folks, just in general. I think most people don't wake up wanting to hurt other people, but here's the problem. If you have a job that involves enforcing the law in a society where the law is the problem, right? Let me repeat. If you have a job to enforce the law in a society where the law itself is the problem, that is to say segregation as a law, enslavement as a law, indigenous removal as a law, right? The dislocation and dispossession of Latinx peoples from their land, where that's a law, where Japanese internment is a law, right? Then the people whose job is to enforce that law by definition are agents of injustice. That's not about hating police. That's just obvious, right? If you are the enforcer of the system and the system is the problem, then you are part of the problem. If you want to be part of the solution, you got to flip that system. Right? You can't stand at the end of the conveyor belt in the factory marked sausage factory and be shocked when all the stuff it sends you is sausage. If you're sitting down there and you're like, where the hell are my chicken nuggets? You clearly did not read the sign, yo. It said it was about sausage. So you probably ought to understand the system is attributing and producing exactly what it was intended to produce, right? And if you understand the history, that doesn't sound radical. It just sounds obvious, right? But if you don't know that history, it seems absurd. So you got to understand the past to understand the present. That's the point. But it's not just with regard to policing, right? It's with regard to just any inequities that you see. And I think about this not as an educator, not as a writer, not as a scholar, activist, or anything. I think about this as a dad, right? Because like I said, I got these two girls, they're 15 and 13. And, you know, when you're a parent, you always sort of pay real close attention to how your kids learn stuff, right? And you can see, like, when the light bulb goes on over their head, and it's sort of a really amazing moment because you're like, oh, my God, they just figured out something, and sort of cool, and, you know, you try to commit that to memory. All right, so a couple years ago, I'm driving with my girls to their dance studio. They're dancers. And we were leaving their school to drive to the studio, about 8 minutes on surface streets in Nashville, Tennessee, from their school to the downtown studio, where they were both in the company. And it's a drive we've made every day, virtually every day for like a year and a half during the week and once on weekends. So we're used to this drive. But on this particular day, something different happened. We get stopped at a red light. And that red light happens to be in the middle of public housing, right? Both sides of the street, public housing apartments, or what we refer to in this country as projects, right? And the 10-year-old daughter, whose name is Rachel, sitting in the back seat, looks around, and I'm sure she had recognized the racial demographic of that neighborhood before, because we've been making the drive every day, right? But that day she says, Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? Oh, that's a hell of a good question, right? I mean, that's a really deep. Like my kid, my 10-year-old, is doing like urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander, y'all. That's like some pretty serious stuff. Like I was very proud too, you know, because after all, this is what I do, right? And she's like noticing stuff, and I'm like, oh, I'm so proud. And I'm real happy because it's like the one question she could have asked me that I actually know the answer to, right? Because when you're a parent, your kids will ask you all kinds of crazy shit that you have no idea how to answer. Like if my daughter had said, Daddy, where does electricity come from? I'd have been like, psh, Google it. I have no idea. I didn't pay attention in that class. But the one about how this neighborhood got black, I know that. That's the one. And so I'm all excited. I got the answer ready. I can't give her the PhD level answer because we only got 4 minutes left before we're at the studio, right? So I know I got to cut it down. I got to make it sort of easy. You know, I got to make it digestible, right? So I've got the thumbnail version, though. It's right here in my throat. It's about to come out. And then something happened that I didn't know was going to happen because I'm an only child, right? I didn't know this was a thing, but those of you who are not only children will instantly recognize what I mean. Apparently, when you have an older sibling, and you are in the presence of that older sibling, and you ask a question of your parent, right, and the older sibling hears the question, they will inevitably, and without very much hesitation, offer up their own damn answer, right, just to show how smart they are. right? And so Rachel says, remember the question, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? And Ashton, the 12-year-old, without missing a beat, as I'm getting ready to offer the answer, jumps up and says, redlining, which is scary-ass accurate if you know the history. And if you don't, you're about to. I was like, what? How did you know that? Have you been reading my books? Like, what? Is it genetic? Do you just know shit? Do you just is it passed down generationally to you just because daddy knows? That's crazy. It was creepy. And the 10-year-old said, I don't think I know what redlining means. I'm like, yeah, I don't think your sister does either, but that was a hell of a guess. Right? Now, here's the thing. To be honest with you, her answer is not quite right. She actually sort of got it twisted a little bit because redlining is not how it got black, but it is how it got poor. So she's sort of conflating race and class, but I'm going to give her half credit because, damn, she's 12 years old at the time. But let me just sort of explain to you what redlining is. Redlining is a thing that some of y'all will know what this is, but in any event, it was something that was very common. It was done as a matter of course all through this country, north, south, east, west, everything in between, where banks would take maps of neighborhoods and they would take a red marker and they would draw a line around black neighborhoods, and occasionally they would do the same with Latinx neighborhoods, but especially black neighborhoods. And anybody who lived in the boundaries of that neighborhood was not going to get a loan. You weren't going to get a business loan. You weren't going to get a mortgage loan, nothing. And it didn't matter if you had good credit, didn't matter. Didn't matter if you had a good job, didn't matter. Didn't matter if you had a good education, none of it mattered. You weren't getting a loan just because you lived in that space. And this was done generation in and generation out as a formal and totally legal above-board practice until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. But even after that, the research tells us it continued indirectly, sort of informally, secretly. The research today says we probably got 3 to 4 million cases of housing discrimination against people of color every year based on race. About half of those are in the mortgage market. The other half are in the rental market. So in other words, it's still happening. But it used to be totally legal. And as a result, right, that meant that those communities were starved of wealth. Those communities were starved of capital, right? Folks weren't able to start up businesses. And by the way, at the very same time they couldn't get those loans, they were knocking down neighborhoods to put up interstates and to put up shopping malls and to put up garages and office buildings. And most of the houses that got knocked down and apartments that got knocked down were being lived in by black and brown folks. 20% of all African-American housing in the country was knocked to the ground between 1950 and 1969 to make way for economic progress, highways, et cetera, right? So people of color were being denied capital, and the stuff they already had was being flattened by bulldozers, right? So that's how those neighborhoods became poor. But how did they actually become black or black and brown combined, folks of color? Well, that happened for a couple of reasons that are really important to know. First of all, most people don't know this history, but like Baldwin said, if you don't understand it, right, then you're not going to understand what you see. That's the effect of what he was saying in that quote I started with. What happens is the public housing that we were looking at right there in Nashville, and this is true public housing nationwide, that was created not for people of color. Most people don't know this history, but you need to. Public housing was created for white folks. Right? For the first couple of years, it was very hard in most parts of the country for people of color to even get access to publicly subsidized housing. It was created for poor white folks to give them an opportunity, a leg up to come into the so-called middle class. But at the very same time that the government creates those public interventions in the housing market for white people, they also created some other programs that were sort of duplications of that, but even better. They create the FHA loan program, the VA loan program, later on the GI Bill program. In theory, these were open to everybody, but in practice, virtually all the benefits went to white folks because the criteria to qualify for these loans, which were government guaranteed loans without which you could not have gotten a house in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Virtually all the benefits went to whites because the underwriting criteria, the lending criteria, essentially excluded almost all people of color, with just a few exceptions. So in other words, the neighborhoods became racially identifiable because certain folks were able to hustle it out to the suburbs using those loans, right? Leaving the ones who couldn't get the loans in the city. And then you couldn't get a loan in the city because of redlining and other forms of discrimination. So these neighborhoods become white, these become black and brown, these become middle class to affluent, these become poor, not because of anything having to do with the people that live there, but having to do with the decisions made by people who most definitely do not live there, right? Now, I get to the end of that story and we're at the studio. I drop the kids off and I'm wondering, God, I hope they got it, They seem to. They're nodding. Oh, yeah, okay. They seem to understand, yeah? And as I'm driving away, I think to myself, that's a really important story, because what if my kids ask me that and I don't know the answer? What if your kids ask you and you don't? What if a child asks a teacher in a classroom and they don't because they were never taught it? Because were any of us really taught in K-12 about that process of racial discrimination? I wasn't. I wasn't taught in AP history, and hell, that's the history for smart people. That's what they tell you. That's the history where you can supposedly handle anything. Apparently not that, though. You can't handle that. So they don't tell you that, right? And if I don't know the answer, do you think my kid stops wondering about the question? No. See, my 10-year-old who wanted to know why the neighborhood looked the way it did, right, is going to keep wondering. But if she asks and I'm like, oh, I don't know, she's going to keep wondering, what do you think her conclusion is going to be? Because she's going to come to her own conclusion. And you know what that conclusion is going to be. The only one it can be in this culture. It's the conclusion that this society has already handed her on a silver platter. What is it? You know, because it's the conclusion that comes from the fundamental guiding ideology of our country, the thing that we've all been taught, the thing that we've all been exposed to, the secular gospel of America, the creation myth of America, Genesis 1:1 of America. And you know what it is. The Genesis 1:1 of this country is what? Wherever you end up is all about you. Right? Because if you just worked hard, you'd have made it. If you didn't make it, there's something wrong with you. You should have worked harder. The notion of rugged individualism, right? That's the fundamental building block of our country. But if you're taught that, and then you look around and you see this level of inequality, and you don't know the backstory of how we got that inequality, then you end up defaulting to the idea that these people are down here living like this because there's something wrong with them. And these people over here are up here living like this because they're superior. In other words, racism becomes almost rational unless you question that ideology. Just like sexism does, right? Because if you look around and you see men disproportionately on the hierarchy, right, and you see women disproportionately below them on that hierarchy, then it becomes almost logical for people, even women, to internalize a belief that they don't have the same capacity as men. Classism becomes rational, where you look down even on poor white folks. You look down on poor white folks in coal country and Appalachia. You go, well, if they would just work harder, everything would be fine. We don't have to do anything to the job market or the larger economy because they're to blame. In other words, if we don't understand how we got from point A to point B to point whatever we're at now, we end up making conclusions that are fundamentally going to reinforce racism, sexism, and classism. And here's the thing. Every one of us knows that that myth is a myth. We know it's not about simple, rugged individualism. We all know people, do we not, who have worked hard their whole lives, got nothing to show for it. And we all know people who were born on third base and think they hit a triple, right? Never had to work hard, right? And they'll never lose what they've got. I'm even told, now this may be a rumor, y'all tell me, but I was told, as hard as this may be to believe, that there are even people who inherited their father's real estate empire in the 1970s, got to take over his real estate portfolio in the 1970s when it was worth $227 million already, and turned it into a few billion and decides that makes him a self-made billionaire. Have y'all heard that story? I heard that story. I don't know who I'm talking about. I forget the name, but I feel like that's a thing, right? We know it's not about rugged individualism. It's about head starts, who had them and who didn't. It's about an 8-lap relay race where some folks started on lap 5, and some folks had to start at lap 1, and then were shocked when the ones with the 5-lap head start crossed the finish line first. That's what's supposed to happen when you have a 5-lap head start. Yes? Right? And so ultimately and look, the rugged, first of all, like even if you don't like my politics, can we just agree that there's no such thing as a rugged individual? That's like some crazy shit. Like really, truly crazy. Because what would that even entail? First of all, there's no such thing as an individual human being, right? Because humans have always lived in collectives. We are a social being. We're a social species. None of us were raised by ourselves on an island by a porpoise, right? We've had families, we've had tribes, we've had cultures, we've had nations, right? We've all been raised in a social context. None of us were raised by a porpoise on an island. If you ever actually meet someone who qualifies as a true rugged individual, for the love of God, you need to get the hell away from that thing, because it's going to be dangerous as hell. It's going to be like a feral animal. It's not going to have language, right? It's not going to know that it's not supposed to eat you because nobody ever told it that, right? Because it was a rugged individual being raised by the porpoise on the island. They see you, they're like, I'm just going to eat you. They don't know. Rugged individuals would be dangerous. You don't want them running your country. You don't want them running your business. You don't want them as neighbors, right? The good news is there aren't any such people. We've all had help. We've all been raised in a social context. We have to understand that context in order to understand how we arrived at our current position and at our current place, right? And it's very dangerous for us not to do that, right? It's dangerous when we think about the policing thing again. I can tell you right now, the only reason I'm standing here. See, if I'm going to ask you to think about that, how you ended up from point A to point B, I got to do the same. So I'll model the behavior I'm asking about. Because once again, this is where privilege comes in. This is where we have to understand the context of our own lives. I'm only standing here because the war on drugs is not about drugs, right? Going back to that issue of policing. I'm only here because the war on drugs isn't really about the thing it pretends to be about. What do I mean by that? I think you know what I mean by that. And I can tell you what I'm about to tell you because the statute of limitations has expired on this shit and they can't touch me now. I'm being quite serious. Keep in mind now, the reason I know the war on drugs isn't about drugs, two things. One is all the data tells me. Centers for Disease Control, National Institutes on Drug Abuse, every study you choose to consult says what? White folks are just as likely, if not more likely, to use drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to possess drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, to sell drugs, just as likely, if not more likely, than people of color to become addicted to them, right? So the rates of usage, possession, dealing, and addiction equal or greater, depending on the age group for whites, relative to people of color. That's one way that I know. The other way is the fact that I'm here. Because in April of 1988, I was headed back from a college debate tournament. I was at Tulane University in New Orleans. We went to a debate tournament in San Antonio, driving a rental car back, right? And I get stopped in Gonzales, Texas. I do not recommend this, by the way. I get stopped in Gonzales, going about 13 miles an hour over the limit. So I pull over. It's just me, my debate partner, another two-person team, and the coach. And I'm nervous, right? And I'm nervous because I know what's in the car, other than debate evidence. I know that at that moment, in the briefcase of my coach, is the following: 1.5 ounces of weed, an 8-ball of coke, 12 sheets of acid. Yeah, Google it, and 14 hits of X. Now, not bragging, by the way, and I'm not encouraging this behavior. Yeah, I'm not. I'm just asking you a fundamental question. You know what the question's going to be, but I got to keep setting this thing up. Now, for those who are not drug users, either now or at any point, that is not for personal consumption, as you can probably imagine. That would kill anyone who tried to do all that. So that was my coach. He was a dealer on the debate circuit. He would deal to other coaches. He would deal to debaters, right? So I get pulled over, and I know that's in there. And I'm nervous as hell because he comes to the door with that flashlight, right? Puts it in the face, and he's like, I need to see your license. I'm like, of course. I'm looking for it. I'm looking for the damn thing. It's a wallet. It's got like 4 places it could be. Can't find the damn thing. And it seemed like it took 30 minutes. It was probably 20 seconds. But it seemed like it was a half an hour. I'm sweating, right? My eyes are getting big. I'm sweating crazy, just profusely. The air's on, doesn't matter. Sweating, right? And I just know that this is not going to go well. He says, would you like to come back and sit in the cruiser where the light's better? I'm like, okay. I go back there. He's right, man. The light is way better in the police car. So I'm looking for it, right? And finally, I turn over this one little, flap where you put pictures and credit cards and stuff, and there's my fake ID. I got that. He sees it. He goes, isn't that it? I'm like, no. That's something else. I don't know. That's like a craft project. I don't know what the hell that is. I don't know, even though it said driver's license right on the damn top. And he saw it, and he's like, are you sure? And he starts to reach for it. And just as he starts to reach for it, now keep in mind, just the license alone is a misdemeanor offense, $500 fine, up to 60 days in jail potentially. He probably wouldn't have gone to jail for it, but they're going to search the car when he gets it, right? So he's reaching for it. And just as he does, I find my real license that magically reappears in a place that I thought I had searched 5 times. And I'm like, here it is. Oh, here it is, right? And he goes, You sure that's it? And he gave me a look that said he knew. He writes me a $75 ticket. He lets me go. Now, if you think that he wouldn't have searched that car with all the nervousness that I was exuding, the at least suspicious behavior that would suggest possibly something greater was up. If you don't think he would have searched that car if I were black or brown, you have not been paying attention. And I don't mean to this lecture. I mean to life in general in America, right? So see, that doesn't take away from whatever genuine abilities I have as a speaker or as a writer or as a scholar or as a whatever, right? But it means that every one of us is where we are because of a confluence of factors, some of which have to do with privilege that we didn't earn, some of which are just about luck. Because the other reason I'm standing here is even stranger than that one. The reason I'm really standing here is because right after I graduated from college, I got a job in Louisiana working against a white supremacist neo-Nazi former Klan leader named David Duke, who was running for the U.S. Senate and governor in Louisiana in 90 and 91. All right, I was involved in the campaigns against him. It was sort of a high-profile thing, so those of us who worked in that effort got a lot of attention, probably more than the person who's 23 years old typically would have doing this work. But the only reason I got to do that job was because I'd gone to Tulane and I met the two men who started that organization. If I go to any other college, I don't meet them, right? And the only reason I went to Tulane is because when I came out of high school, I was chasing a girl that went to Louisiana State, right? That's the truth, right? I'd never even thought of Tulane, but I meet this girl at a summer debate camp. I realize I'm totally like geeking out on debate right now, but you just got to understand these are important stories, you know, central to my life. I was at a debate camp at American University in D.C. summer between junior and senior year. I meet this girl, and in the manner of a 16-year-old, I fall in love, right? And I tell her I'm going to go to Emory in Atlanta. That was where I was going to go. She's like, no, you can't go to Atlanta for college. We'll never see each other. You have to go to Tulane because then you'll only be an hour away, hour and 15. And then I'm like, oh, of course, I will completely change my entire life. Of course, that's what I'm going to do. Naturally, that's what I'm going to do. Screw my entire life plan. I'm following you because those relationships always work out. And I'm not bitter, by the way. It worked out really well for me and for her separately, but, you know. But if I don't meet her and she doesn't convince me to go to Tulane, I don't meet those men. And if I don't meet those men who start that organization, I don't get that job. And if I don't get that job fighting David Duke, my whole life goes in a fundamentally different direction. But here's the thing. The only reason I met her was because I was a debater. If I hadn't been a debater, I wouldn't have done that. The only reason I was a debater was because, and that hadn't been my plan either. That hadn't been my path, at least I didn't think. When I was a kid, I thought my path was baseball. I was a really good baseball player. Not as good as Donald Trump now, because you've heard Donald Trump wants you to know he was the best baseball player in New York City in 1962. That happens to be a year that the Yankees won the World Series, but he was better than all of the players on the Yankees. He literally said this. So I wasn't Donald Trump good, but I was good. And I thought, I had college scouts come into my games when I was like 11 or 12, and so I thought, man, that's going to be my path. But then tried out for the high school team, had the most inexplicably horrible tryout in the history of tryouts. It's like I couldn't catch anymore. I couldn't throw. I forgot all the rules of the game. I get cut and had to find a different activity, which became debate. If I make that team, I'm not going to be debating. I'm going to be playing ball. If I'm not debating, I don't meet Monica at American University. I don't end up at Tulane. You know the rest of the story. What I'm really trying to tell you is I owe everything to that asshole that cut me from the baseball team. And to Coach Cantrell, I say thank you. Well played, because that ultimately made the difference. The point I'm trying to make is we got to challenge this notion of meritocracy. This idea that we end up where we are just because of our own hard work and our own effort, right? That's not true for me, as I've just proven. It's not true for any of us. Anywhere we get in life, we've had help. Some of it's been about race, some of it's been about gender, some of it's been about class, and some of it, like the baseball story, is just about luck, right? And if we'd be willing to own that, we'd be quite a ways further towards challenging racism, sexism, classism, and all these forms of inequality, because we wouldn't be looking down on folks who hadn't made it yet. Right? Because we could see ourselves in them and we could see them in us. It's only when we separate ourselves. Same thing is true with the immigration debate, right? Think about this. Our inability to understand the history of our own as white people, immigration is what gets us all twisted about brown folk coming, right? Because when Donald Trump gets up and says, well, Mexico, they're not sending their best. The hell, you think England sent their best? Y'all do know the best don't leave, right? The best sort of stay where they're at because they're winning. That's sort of the whole point. Like if you're the best, you ain't getting on the boat, right? I mean, the best are already, why the hell would they leave, man? They got everything they want. It's not like sometime around 1642, there's some British nobleman that gets his family together around the fireplace in the big castle and goes, all right, I've been giving this some thought, and I've consulted with your mom, not much, because it's like 1642, and I don't even have to ask her damn opinion. But we've been talking about it, and I think even though, I know you like the castle, right? It's great, right? I know, it's brilliant, it's great. I know, it's fantastic. You remember last weekend we were at the King's? I know, right? You like the King's children, right? They're fabulous. I know you're out there riding on the ponies. We got all this gold. We do all these great things that rich people do in 1642. It's fantastic. But to hell with all that. I've got an idea. And we've decided that in 2 weeks from now, we're going to ask you to gather up your things. Just gather up your things. Just all that you can carry. Nothing else. Just gather up your things. And we are going to get on a boat. A rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy, to be honest. We might sink. We might be eaten by sharks. We might get scurvy or be hijacked by pirates. However, if we survive, I'm sure you'll agree that in a year hence, you'll be able to look back and say it was an excellent, fantastic adventure. Okay, that shit did not happen. The best did not leave because the winners always stay put. Only those who were suffering and losing in the system leave, and there's no shame in that. But there's no shame in it when English folk do it, and there's no shame when Mexican folk do it, and folks from Sri Lanka do it, and folks from Honduras and Guatemala do it, when folks from the continent of Africa do it. There's no shame when anybody gets up and says, I'm starting over. But see, the difference is black folks in this country know how they got here. And indigenous peoples know how they were here before, and Latinx folks, if they're in touch with the indigeneity of their heritage, also know that their people were here first. It's only European folks who apparently forgot that, as James Baldwin said, our ancestors didn't want to come either, right? We didn't want to, we had no choice. And if we understand that, it gets harder, doesn't it, to look down on folks, right? Because you understand what motivates them is the same, but we tell ourselves a lie. We say, well, we came for freedom. And they're just coming for stuff. The hell, we came for stuff. Land, we came for land, we came for opportunity, we came for a new start. Even if you came for quote unquote freedom, that would still be some stuff, but we didn't come for that. All you gotta do is look at the kind of system we set up in the colonies. This is a pretty unfree system. We spent most of our time in the colonies oppressing each other for not being the right kind of Christian and trying to figure out who the witch was so we could kill her. Wasn't about freedom. Right? It was about a new form of tyranny. So the reality is migration is always about the search for opportunity. People don't like to move, right? Folks from Mexico don't just cross the border and come here like for shits and giggles because they got nothing else to do, right? Nobody likes to move, man. I moved 5 years ago, 3 blocks, y'all. 3 blocks, and it damn near killed me. I was like, I'm never doing this again. I hate this. I told my wife, don't ask me to ever move. 3 blocks, and I was just done. Right? You think folks want to pick up and leave the country, the only country they know, their heritage, their language, their culture, their friends, family members, just to take advantage of some cheap-ass, inadequate health care and some low wages, and to be exploited and shot at in the desert for even making the attempt? The hell do we think people do? People do those things out of desperation. If we understand that, then the judgmentalism is a lot harder because, once again, I can see me in you and I can see you in me. So you got to understand your own past if you're going to understand other folks' present because they're operating on the same motivations that we were. You understand? But this is not just an academic point. I want to suggest to you that it's bigger than that, and it's something that white folks better concern ourselves with because I think sometimes we very easily, and I understand why, but it's a problem. We very easily and readily assume that the reason we got to change stuff up in this country and fix this problem is to save people of color. Well, here's the thing. Obviously, the impact of white supremacy on people of color is the first and foremost order of business, but it's not white folks' job to save black and brown people. Black and brown folks will liberate themselves from this system, whether we're with them or not. The question that I want white folks to ask is who's going to liberate us from this system, because it's doing a number on our mentality. It's doing a number on our humanity, and it's even dangerous for our health. Now, that may seem odd. How can a system that gives you advantages and benefits and opportunities actually be dangerous and bad for your health? Well, think about this. Go back to that point I made a few minutes ago about the notion of meritocracy and individualism, right? If I think, because I've been told, that wherever I end up is all about me, and I actually believe that, and then I find myself struggling, how do I make sense of that? See, when black and brown folks are told, hey, wherever you end up, it's your own fault, right? People of color sort of have enough of a history to know that that's pretty much bullshit, right? People of color have been around the block long enough to know that for the most part, it's always been more complicated than that. So folks of color always at least question that a little bit, if not a lot. But white Americans have been the group that's been able to sort of buy the myth, right? I'm not saying that white folks haven't struggled, but I'm saying that historically, white folks, even working class white folks, were able to say to themselves, listen, if I just play by the rules and I work hard and I keep my head down, and if I have a strong back and I can lift stuff, I'll always have a job. Right? Even those white folks in the coal mines who clearly don't have economic privilege, I mean, they're struggling. They're dying at 55 years old from black lung, occupational disease, and injury. So they're not economically privileged, but even they historically, right, were able to look around and at least say to themselves, hey, as long as I do everything right, my kid will be better off than I was. Just like I was better off than my dad. Or they could say, well, my granddaddy worked in the mine, my daddy worked in the mine, I work in the mine, and my son's going to get a job in the mine when he graduates. But even the ability to take that for granted was sort of a privilege, wasn't it? Because folks of color have never been able to just say, oh, I'm sure there'll be jobs for me as long as I'm willing to work, right? Because people of color know that's not the way it's gone down. But if I'm a white person and you've promised me that as my birthright in this country, and then all of a sudden, I don't have a job. All of a sudden, the economy changes, right? And the assembly line shut down because the boss can make more money sending the jobs overseas, right? Or the coal mine shuts down, not because of regulations, not because of environmentalists, which is what they want us to believe, but because the guy that owns the coal mine learned that it's actually cheaper to just blow the top off a mountain with dynamite, right, and go in and get the coal that way than it is to actually use all the labor that they used to use. So it's about saving rich people money. And now these working class folks are out of work, can't find a job, 26 weeks, 52 weeks during the height of the recession. Some folks out of work 99 weeks, including millions of white folks who were told that would never happen to us, right? Now, if you tell me that's not going to happen to me, and now it does, and you tell me that wherever I end up is all about my own effort, I got two choices, don't I? I can either start to hate myself, right, and start to think that I'm the problem, that I'm just not good enough, right, that I'm not working good enough, that maybe my work ethic isn't good enough, that maybe I'm not smart enough, that maybe I'm not committed enough, that maybe I can't support my family. But that's hard to swallow, isn't it? It's hard to take that on. So my other option is I got to displace my anger and my anxiety and my frustration onto somebody else, right? So in other words, I'm dealing with all this self-doubt and all this pain. I got to find somebody to put the pain on. And then a politician comes along, and that politician says, I can take your pain and I can tell you who's to blame for it, and it's not you. Oh yeah, when those people on that side of town are out of work, it is their fault. But when you're out of work, it's also their fault, right? So you don't have to, that whole myth of meritocracy, that doesn't apply to you. And this stuff works, man. I got an email from a young guy a couple years back, young white guy, and that was his thing. He's like, I can't find a job because blacks and Mexicans are taking all the jobs. For real, all the jobs are being taken by black folks and Mexicans. Where the hell are these jobs at? Second Life, right? Are they on Minecraft or some shit, some video game? Like, where are these jobs? Because the data tells me that black folks with a college degree are still almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, no matter what their major, by the way. Tells me that Latinx folks with a degree are still 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. That Asian American and Pacific Islanders with a degree are still 23% more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. That our indigenous brothers and sisters with a degree are 2/3 more likely than whites with a degree to be unemployed. So wherever in the hell people of color are taking all these white jobs, they're not taking them far, right? Plus, it's sort of weird, isn't it, when people say, they took my job. Well, did you have the job already? Because if you didn't have it, it wasn't yours, you understand? Like, it's not like, I mean, I guess it'd be really wrong. Like, if the boss hired the white dude on Monday, and then on Wednesday he was like, yeah, just kidding. No, I'm giving it to the Latino guy over there. That might be a little unfair, right? I mean, I've had this job for 2 whole days, and then they, I would understand. But that's not what's happening. Plus, the dude that wrote me this email that said this about people of color taking all the jobs, like the next paragraph, his next statement out of his mouth was that black and Latino folks are lazy. All right, which is it? Because it can't be both. If you took all the jobs, I'm pretty sure you're not lazy. And if you're lazy, I'm thinking you didn't even take one job, let alone all the damn jobs. And I have this image whenever I hear this. White folks say this all the time, this victimology. Whether they're taking the jobs. I get this image in my head of like this white Iowa farmer, right? Wakes up at like 4:30 in the morning to milk the cows, right? Walks out to the barn, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cows, time to milk the cow. Opens up the barn, he's like, well, I'll be damned. These cows have already been milked. Who took my job? And then Andre shoots up from behind the barn and goes, it's me, Andre from Detroit. I took that shit. The hell do we think is happening in this country? That is not a thing. That is not a thing, right? But the thing is, if you have a politician that swears by that, and if you're in enough pain, right, you'll believe anything. You can put the blame on, you say, we build a wall down here, everything will be fine. Really? You think that's how capitalism works? You just build a wall and then everybody gets a big raise because the capitalists are like, oh, they figured us out. Now we got to give everybody more money. No, capital will always cross the border. Capital will always cross the border in search of the highest rate of return. I know the president thinks that he can shut that down with some mean tweets at 4 a.m. That if he just sends out a tweet that says, you're not moving, you're staying here, that they're going to go, oh, well, I was going to make, $12 billion extra by moving the plant to Sri Lanka, but what the hell, the president says I can't, so I guess I'll stay. That's not real. Goods will always cross borders in search of the highest price, right? So if you got capital mobility and you've got goods mobility, but you don't have labor mobility, what happens? You actually rig the game against working people. Because if workers can't go where they get the highest wage, that hurts all working people, see? But we don't think about that, or we don't think about how we got in this political moment. The thing that's so important to understand about Trumpism, not Trump, Trumpism, is that it's really not a new thing. It's really not. Because the whole history of this country is the history of what we just saw happen. Keep hearing people say, we can't normalize Trump. We can't normalize Trump. Well, there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily normal and typical about Donald Trump and his rhetoric and some of the stuff he does. But there's other things that are excruciatingly normal, right? That have been typical and going on for a really long time, right? Because if you had to sum up the history of this country in one sentence with regard to race and class, you know what that sentence would be? That sentence would be that the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. That the history of America is the history of rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. It starts in the colonies when there were no white people yet. And you may think, that's a weird thing to say. What do you mean? Well, I mean, there were Europeans. We didn't call ourselves white. We hadn't come up with that term yet. We didn't have this pan-European identity, right? We hated each other. We spent most of history killing each other. The English hated the Irish and vice versa. Northern Italians didn't even think Southern Italians were Italian. The Germans hated everybody, and everybody hated their ass right back. There was no white race, and then in the colonies, all of a sudden there is. What happened to justify the creation of this thing? Well, nothing really, except that the elite in the colonies could look around, mid-1600s, and they could count. And when they counted, what they saw was that they were way outnumbered. You take all the African enslaved folks, the European indentured servants who were just one level above slavery, and you take the other piss-poor Europeans who aren't technically indentured, but they might as well be. They're peasants. They don't have anything. And you put them all together. In most of the colonial period, they outnumbered the rich by 10 to 1, 15, 20, 30 to 1, had a handful of people that owned all the wealth, sort of like today. We got 38 people in this country right now that have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the country. 165 million people over here, 38 over here. So this thing has been going on a long time. So the rich look around, they see they're outnumbered, and they're worried, as you can imagine, right? They're thinking to themselves, holy hell, man. If they figure out that we're running a game on all of them, they're going to come and take our stuff, right? There's going to be a revolution, right? And they're going to come and take our stuff. And so we got to split these coalitions, because every now and then there would be rebellions that were cross-color, cross-racial. You would have Bacon's Rebellion as one, but there were others where you had folks of color and white folks joining together to overthrow the aristocracy, but the aristocracy can't have that, so they create this notion of whiteness, and they say to even the poorest European, you're better than even the best off black person. You're better than the indigenous. You're better, later on they would say, than those Mexicans, or better than those Chinese that we brought in to work the railroads, right? In other words, they created what W.E.B. Du Bois, the great sociologist, would later call the psychological wage of whiteness, right? The idea that, well, I may not have much, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm not brown. At least I got this right here, right? And the fact is, when you don't have anything but this will spend really well, right? You see, if you're rich, this is a bit redundant, isn't it? Like if you're rich enough, this is nice, but you don't have to have it. But if you're poor and you don't have anything else, this is the coin of the realm, and you will cash that check. And so all of a sudden, these white folks who were given the right to vote, at least if they were men, right? And they were able to own land, not much, but a little. And what they do, they put the men on the slave patrol to help keep black folks in line, see? Gave them a taste of power, not real power. They still didn't run the show. They still didn't make the laws. They still didn't own the bulk of the land, but they were riding around on a horse with a gun and a badge, and it made them feel big, made them feel strong, made them feel like they had a stake in this thing called whiteness, and those rebellions stopped. And the elite won. Rich white men telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Fast forward, Civil War era, same thing. The rich white folks in my part of the world, in the American South, openly announce that the reason they want to secede from the Union and possibly go to war is to maintain white supremacy and the institution of slavery. They were very blatant about it then. We lie now and say that it wasn't about that. But back then we didn't have any shame, so we just said it, right? But the problem, see, was that if I tell you the reason we got to break away and go to war, and many of y'all might die, is because I need to protect my property in human beings, how do I get you to go fight for me when you don't own any human beings because you're poor? Because you do know the rich don't go to war, right? The rich don't go fight. They get poor people to do that, whether it's in the 1800s or right now. Rich people get doctors to write notes saying they have heel spurs so they can't go to Vietnam. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you can Google that tonight and figure that one out for yourself. Right? Rich folks never go fight. They get poor people to do it. So think about what a trick that was. If I just told you the reason we got to go to war is so I can keep my slaves, and you're a poor white person, doesn't even own any, why would you go fight for my stuff? Right? You would, because I come to you and I tell you, man, if they get free, they're going to take your job. They're going to displace you. No, fool. They already displaced you. That's the point. Because if you're white and you got to charge $1 a day to work on that farm, and the guy that owns the farm can get the black person to do it for free because they own him or her, right? Guess who's getting the job? Free is going to get the job. So actually, poor white folks would have been better off saying to hell with all this, joining with black folks to overthrow the system of enslavement that was bidding down the wages of all working people. But the psychological wage of whiteness kicked in, and divide and conquer work. Fast forward to the 30s, labor union movement. You got white labor leaders that didn't want to integrate the union because they had swallowed it. They had bought it, right? And they were saying things like, well, we can't integrate. My God, if we bring these black folks and these Mexican folk and these Chinese folk into the union, they're going to reduce the professionalism of our craft. No, fool, they're going to double the size of your union. And that's probably really helpful when you go on strike. Right? Because when you go on strike, if you don't have them next to you on the strike line, guess who the boss is going to replace you with? The very black and brown folks that you didn't want to stand next to and work next to, right? And then you're going to blame them for taking your job, not the rich white dude who gave it away just to split y'all off of one another and divide and conquer you. And here it is again, right? 80 years later, working on immigration, same thing, telling folks the reason they don't have a job is not because of Wall Street, which I beg to remind you was not destroyed by Mexicans, documented or not, was not destroyed by black folks, was not destroyed by peoples of color. It's just the highest SAT having white boys in the banking industry, right? These all had they had business degrees. Like, God, you know they got to be smart. They had high SATs. And I know people get upset when I say that they were white. They're like, that's sort of racist. It's not racist. It's descriptive, right? And if they had been black or brown, all y'all would have noticed. Everybody would have noticed. If it had been black folks or brown folks that took off with $13 billion worth of other people's money, or stole it, or lost it, or squandered it. If black and brown folks lose trillion, 13 trillion, if you lose that kind of money and you're black or brown, there's not another banking job that a black or brown person is ever going to get. Not even like a teller, not even like a drive-through window, right? Just no, you're not getting these jobs. White boys destroy Wall Street, lose trillions, and the result is what? That they keep getting bonuses. They keep getting bonuses. Nobody's going into the business schools and saying, look, white guys, I know you want to be bankers, but you've proven yourself incapable of the task, and we're giving those jobs to people of color now, or perhaps some women, but of all colors, but definitely not white boys, right? Nobody's doing that. I'm not saying they should. I'm just saying we have a different standard, right? And that's the problem. We got people looking over here at the problem rather than over here where the problem is, because for 400 plus years, we've been told that the enemy was black and brown. That divide and conquer is not new, but it keeps working, and we have to push back against it, because if I don't push back against it and I'm a white person and I internalize all that shame when I'm struggling, my only options are either scapegoat somebody else, which means the problem doesn't get solved, right? And I'm still going to be hurting. Or the other option is I can destroy myself, and y'all know some folks are doing that because you've heard about the opioid crisis, right? They keep talking about this, these white folks in small town America that are getting hooked on Oxy, and then the Oxy, is not strong enough, so they're getting street heroin. It's interesting that we call this a crisis, and we have all this sympathy for it, because there was an opioid crisis in the 70s, mostly headquartered and located in black and brown poor communities, and we did not call it a crisis. We did not counsel rehab, education, and treatment. We counseled prison. We called people junkies, and we locked them away. And the same thing is true when the crack epidemic hits in the 1980s and 90s. We call people addicts, and we lock them away and punish them, not give them rehab. So all of a sudden, white folks, salt of the earth, white people in rural America are getting hooked. We're like, oh my God, we got to help these people. About damn time we have that attitude. About that time that we believe that, right? But here's the thing that's interesting about the opioid crisis and is related to the point I'm trying to make, right? Think about this. There was a study that came out shortly after the election. They were doing these studies to figure out what were the factors that were most highly correlated with Trump's support. And there were a lot of them, and they're hard to sort of disentangle. Sometimes they interact with each other. But one of the most highly correlated factors at the community level with Trump's support, at the county by county level, was the level of opioid addiction in that county. The more people addicted to opiates, the more white folks in particular, addicted to opiates, the higher the level for Trump. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you had to be high to vote for Donald Trump. That's not actually my argument, though it's a fascinating sociological query that the academics in the room might want to engage. Whatever. Good luck with that research. That's not my point. My point is that what is an opiate? Think about it. What is an opiate? Pharmacologically, just like its most basic pharmacological purpose is to do one thing: block pain, right? That's all it does. It doesn't solve the problem. If you got a crushed disc in your back, you're going to need surgery. The opiate is not going to fix your back, but it will get you through, theoretically, until you can get the actual problem solved. Same thing with cancer. They might put you on opiates, right? But that's not going to solve the cancer. You're going to have some other stuff done. So it's sort of like when Donald Trump comes along and says, I got a solution for your pain, that doesn't really speak to the problem. He's like a walking, talking, breathing human opiate, right? And it's killing the very people who take it, right? There's this study came out 2 years ago, found that there's been this huge increase in deaths in white communities, working class, non-college educated, middle-aged white folks, right? An excess death rate in those communities from suicide, opioid addiction, and heavy drinking that causes cirrhosis of the liver, right? Not natural causes. These are self-inflicted wounds. And it's happening in white space, not black and brown space in the same way. In the black and brown spaces, even though the death rates are higher, don't get me wrong, they're headed in the right direction. They're going down. The mortality rates are getting better. In the white community that I just described, they're getting worse. Why? Well, it's not because whites are hurting worse than people of color. Like I said, unemployment, poverty, wealth, any category you want to look at, white folks are better off than people of color, even though millions are struggling. The point is, white folks have been promised this. And if I've been promised this and I'm only getting this, I got to numb the gap between that because I don't know how to deal with that. See, people that never had any expectations learn how to struggle, right? If you never had any expectations, if you always knew that life was a hustle and you're going to have to grind to get where you got to get, then you don't give up when you run up against that wall. But if you were told that you didn't have to hustle, that all you had to do was work hard and play by the rules which people like you, after all, created, and then you hit that wall, you go crazy. You don't know how to deal with that. Well, you told me my life would be an 8 and it's only a 5.5. Oh, hell no, see? So I got to either take you out or I got to take myself out, which is to say that this privilege of expectations that the dominant group has had is really unhealthy. I mean, it's good as long as it all works out, right? But when the economy changes and it doesn't work out for a lot of people, it becomes a self-destructive thing. That notion that where you end up is all about you, uninterrogated, becomes a dagger pointed at the very heart of the people who created that myth in the first place. Back in April of 2011, there was a cover story in Newsweek, and they were interviewing these white guys who were like managers. These weren't even like working class, these were managers, right? And they'd lost their jobs in the recession. Some of them had been out of work for like a year, and they were freaking out, and they're walking around looking for jobs, and this one guy's interviewed, and he says, every time I'm out looking for a job, I feel like I've got a neon sign around my neck that says, unemployed lazy bum. And I remember thinking to myself, man, who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? I know who didn't tell you, unemployed people. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you, black folks. I'll tell you who else didn't tell you, people of color generally. You know who told you that unemployed people were lazy bums? You told you. And people like you told you that they were lazy bums. And so the very ideology that you rocked all those years thinking that it would never come back to bite you on the ass has now come back to bite you on the ass, which is to say you'd have been better off to just listen to people of color from day one. Because they could have told you the system was a scam from the time that they were 12. They could have told you that it was a setup. They could have told you that it was a ripoff. They could have told you that it was a hoax, but we didn't want to believe it. And now we're the ones who are the least prepared for change. That's why you see these videos on YouTube, right, of like this white guy in Starbucks that has this meltdown because he got like bad service from a barista who happened to be black. Check this out. Go look for it. Look for white dude Starbucks meltdown. It'll come up. This guy's going just nuts because he got his latte with soy milk or something and I don't know. And he's yelling at her and he starts using racial slurs against this black barista and throws out there, I voted for Trump. What do you think about that? I don't know, why the hell is that relevant to your order? Right? He just wanted to say it just to like bust it off on her, and so he's yelling at her, using racial slurs, and then he goes on later to tell he feels oppressed. Look, here's the thing. If you think bad service at a coffee joint is oppression, you clearly have never experienced oppression, all right? If you think that bad service at the Starbucks is being oppressed, you've just proven white privilege. I don't even have to give my damn talks. I could just come up, show you that clip and be like, that shit right there, that's what I'm talking about, right? But this obliviousness is dangerous, right? Because that dude's having an existential crisis precisely because he's never had to come up against the idea that maybe his life wasn't going to work out quite the way he thought it was. See, James Baldwin had something to say about this too, and I'll close with it, and then I'll take some questions. Baldwin said, he was talking now, this time, first quote was about white folks. This next one's about black and brown folks, specifically African-American folks, but I think it applies to people of color generally in a system of white supremacy like ours. Baldwin said, I don't mean to sentimentalize suffering, but that person who can never suffer can never grow up, can never learn who they are. That man who has to every day snatch his humanity out of the fires of human cruelty that rage to destroy it, learns something about himself in the process that no school on earth and indeed no church can teach. He gains a sense of his own authority, and that is unshakable. Because in order to save his life, he is constantly having to look at the meaning behind the words, to read between the lines. And he goes on to say, when one is constantly having to survive the worst that life can bring, one eventually ceases to be afraid of the worst that life can bring. And I guess the point I'm trying to make to you is in this era of Trumpism, when folks are sort of popping off and afraid, know this. For the most part, people of color are not afraid because they've seen this movie before. And they are not the ones who were losing their minds at the threat posed by Trumpism. It's those of us who weren't ready. People of color have been trying to tell us for hundreds of years, hold the mirror up to our face and tell us that we have been lying not only to them but to ourselves. And only now are some of us beginning to believe it. For the love of God, let us start listening to those persons of color. Let us join with them, whether it is in the streets, whether it is in the classroom, or whether it is at the ballot box. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we'll take some questions, and then I do have copies of my latest book, which actually, just so you know, in the intro, the one I'm working on, which was supposed to have been out by now, but is not, was mentioned. That was the White Lives Matter book, which is a look at the issue of race crime and police misconduct. That is not out yet, but the one I do have is Under the Affluence, which is the one that looks at the connection between economic and racial inequality, class and race, that came out 15 months ago or 16 months ago. So I do have that, and I'll be happy to sell folks that after we're done. But if you have questions, raise your hand. I don't know if we've got mics. We do have a mic there, and we have a mic here on the side. So if you're physically able to get to the mic, fantastic. If you're not physically able to get to the mic or just don't, some people don't like to get up at the mic and ask questions. I understand. So I can just call on you as well. I'll start here since I see your hand, and then I'm going to move right over there to the mic. Go ahead. Yeah, whoever had their hand. Oh, yeah, go ahead if you can. Great.
Thank you for that. I don't know if the mic's working. Can you hear me?
I don't know if it is. I don't know. Just talk loudly, I guess.
Do you have any advice as to how to handle Trump supporters based on the notion that Hillary Clinton handled Trump supporters wrong, didn't say she understood them, didn't act like she understood them? Any advice for us?
Well, I think, so here's the thing. I think the big mistake that Hillary Clinton made vis-a-vis supporters of Trump, I think, was that when she decided, and I don't know whether it was calculated or not, but when she decided to make the issue them, that they were the ones who were deplorable rather than Donald Trump for the rhetoric that he was using, that was politically a horrible decision. It was also unfair, but it was politically, it was a horrible decision. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of truly deplorable people in that coalition. The white nationalist movement people, the so-called alt-right, which I much preferred when they just went by their much more honest name, Nazis. But those folks are certainly deplorable, but that's not the typical Trump supporter. Now, I don't want to cut too much slack here, but what I do want to say is that I think the smarter approach would have been for her and now for us to say, rather than his people are a bunch of bigots, and some certainly are, and the data certainly says that that had a lot to do with certain people's support and that it may have tipped the balance. But what she should have said was, Donald Trump thinks that you're so racist that you're going to fall for him blaming people who didn't cause these problems. It's almost like a way of saying to the person who actually might be racist, it's almost like appealing to their better nature and saying, surely you're not going to fall for that. He's trying to manipulate you. He's trying to get you to think that the reason you don't have a job is because of Mexicans. But that's not true, and you know better than that, because there's actually some research which says that when people who actually do have bias, and we all have some, we've all been programmed to have it in this culture, one of the best ways to get people not to act on bias is to challenge them to rise to the better angels of their nature and treat them like people who are capable of doing right even when their inclination might be to do wrong. There's all this research on undoing subconscious bias which says that if we appeal to that part of people, now the hardcore bigot, it's not going to make any difference, but nothing's going to make a difference with them. Those people that make up maybe that 10 or 15% that are movable, I think are movable in that way. The second point I would just make is, look, that I have no problem expressing empathy for struggling white folks, but I do suggest that we must demand reciprocity from them. And what I mean by that is, if white folks who were struggling in Appalachia, in coal country, in the automobile industry, and in the Rust Belt states, if they want us to be sympathetic to their pain, and I get it, and we should be, because some of that pain is quite real, but they must extend the same to black and brown folks who have been in pain a long damn time. And they must acknowledge their similarity with those black and brown folks. It cannot be a one-way street. And so I think if we say, listen, we'll meet you there, and we'll listen to what you have to say, but you got to listen to what these folks have been saying for a very long time, because we have to build that kind of coalition, and we're not going to do that by ignoring people of color who have always been right about this thing and suddenly pandering to white folks who just learned yesterday that the system is a setup, right? That's not the way to do it. So that's what I would suggest, at least at first. Thank you. Yes, over here.
Okay, I'm gonna try and make this fast. So I'm out to lunch the other day with my mom, a couple friends, in particular my white friend, blonde, green eyes, the whole bit, her daughter, 6 years old. And her daughter looks at me, her name's Kara, she's the most precious thing ever, but she looks at me and she says, Asia, I was watching TV and I saw there's a group, Black Engineers of America, something like this. Yeah. And she said, but I know that's racist. And I said, really? Why is that racist, Kara? And her mom, she looks at her mom because clearly it's gone too far, she doesn't know what to say. So mom looks over and she says, she sees that I'm about to go, let Kara know. But she says, oh, Asia, just think about it from Kara's perspective. So I had to think, okay, I know what her mom is going to say, but I had to make a decision. Do I go into this lecture now in this pizza joint with everybody watching, or do I save it for later when mom's not around so then I could really get into it with Kara?
Right.
But I want to know, what do you think I should say to her? And if I like what you say, then I'll share it, and she'll be lucky enough to get a response from Tim Wise.
Well, so here's the thing. The question, or even the comment by this little girl who's 6 years old and does not know the context for the creation of the National Society of Black Engineers, which is probably the group you're talking about, it makes perfect sense that she wouldn't get that. It doesn't shock me at all. It's totally understandable. It's developmentally appropriate. I'd be stunned if she didn't think that that was racist, given a 6-year-old's understanding of history, context, and what racism is. So this happened with one of my own kids. One day she asked the question about, at her school they have they have their graduation ceremony, for the high school, for the seniors when they graduate, and this is when this youngest daughter of mine was probably in 5th grade, 4th grade, and so the seniors, when they graduate, they have black seniors have a black graduation ceremony for their family and for their friends, like a special thing. And she was like, Daddy, she wasn't sure. She's like, is that racist to have that? Or why do they need that? Why do they have that? And I said, it makes perfect sense you're asking that question. I said, here's the thing. Historically, people of color were excluded from the same educational opportunities, both in general and at this school in particular. And so as a result, many years ago, black parents decided we ought to do something special to signify the importance to our family, to our community, of succeeding in school, of graduating, of going on to college, not as a way to say that we're better than anyone else or that we're superior, but just as a way to say, hey, we had to overcome some stuff to get here that was special, that was specific to us. And it would be fine for any group who is facing those obstacles to do the same thing, and historically they have. So historically there have been Irish American groups that formed, Jewish American groups, Italian American groups that have formed to celebrate their overcoming obstacles. Now, as the Irish, as the Italian, and as Jewish folks assimilated into whiteness, that became less necessary. But when they were still facing those systemic obstacles, it was very common, and no one questioned it. So really, I said to her, there are also organizations that exist specifically that focus on women and girls like yourself, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, because women and girls face obstacles that are specific to their sex and gender that men do not. And as a result, it's important for them to be able to celebrate, for instance, women engineers and women who are in STEM fields who are often heavily outnumbered. And so when women succeed in those fields, we ought to not only celebrate that, we ought to make a special effort to include, because we know they've been excluded. And once you give that context, then of course she was like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. And so I think that it's just about saying, oh, well, of course, it makes sense that you would ask that. because, if you don't know what came before, you're not going to know why you see what. And so that's a real simple sort of way to put it, or, you can figure out your own way, obviously, to say it. But in general, I think it's just about saying, oh, great question. Here's the answer and the context that you need to understand it. And my guess is she will.
Papa Wise coming through with the suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You bet. Over here. Yes.
Hi, my name's Amber. I'm the managing editor of the Courier paper here on campus. If you've gotten this question before, please humor me. How do you or how would you respond to any criticism that because you are a white male talking about racism, that you're either speaking for black and brown people or that you're profiting or making a living off of racism?
Right. Well, it's a perfectly legitimate question. I get it a lot, but it's a perfectly understandable one. And it's one that any white person doing the work should get and should be ready to answer and prepared to think about. I'm certainly not trying to speak for people of color. That's for sure. Because people of color, whether it's Baldwin, who I quoted, whether it's Du Bois, who I mentioned, or whether it's anyone else, have spoken for themselves well enough, and they don't need me to do it. I don't claim to know the black or brown experience. That's why I told stories about my own. So I'm not even trying to speak for all white people, but I am speaking to the white experience, right? I'm speaking to white privilege. I'm speaking to my own family experiences and these stories that sort of contextualize my own racialized life, right? So I'm telling a story that I am uniquely positioned to tell as a white person in the belly of that beast. So I'm not trying to tell a black or brown truth. I may be sharing truths that black and brown people certainly recognize and that they tell a lot, but the truth that I'm fundamentally trying to speak to is the pathology of whiteness to white people and the damage that it does, in fact, to us, which would be very strange for black and brown folks to focus on, because black and brown folks have got to focus on the impact to them. It would be very weird, I think, for a person of color to talk about, like, oh, the white folks who were killing themselves because of white supremacy. But that is my job, to try to figure out ways to build coalitions. As far as the piece about profiting, I think, look, here's the thing. Anybody who does any job that deals with civil rights, it could be a white person who does civil rights law. There are lots of civil rights attorneys historically. Probably most of them have been people of color, but there have also been some pretty prominent white ones. And I guess one could make the argument that if you do civil rights law and you're white, that you're profiting from racism, or if you teach in a high school about racism in a history class and you're white, that you're profiting from it, or, there's all kinds of arguments that you could make. But at the end of the day, the question is not do I have privilege and not do I receive it in the giving of this speech, but do I utilize that privilege in a way that is as responsible and as accountable as possible? Now, that's an open question, and we can all answer it differently. My feeling is accountability requires a couple of things of me. As I do this work professionally. Number one, if I don't do it professionally, that means, and if white folks generally shouldn't because we make money from it, that means it becomes a hobby. I get very nervous about the idea of white people making this like, well, I could do pottery or I'm going to fight racism. Like I could go to the yoga studio, or I could build model airplanes, or I could fight white supremacy. Like, it seems to me I don't want a hobbyist. I don't think white folks need to dabble in this at the end of their work week when everything else is done. I think it's something we ought to commit to, and if that means that we make a living from it, okay. But to be accountable, I think we got to do a couple things. Number one, we have to try to steer people in our audiences or our readership or on our social media sites nowadays to the work of people of color. And I do that regularly, not only by people that I quote in my speeches, but in my books. The scholars who I reference are disproportionately people of color. The folks whose wisdom I share on social media, disproportionately people of color. The people on the reading list on my website, timwise.org, in the recommended reading section, overwhelmingly people of color. I'll give you a couple of, one particular book I recommend everyone read, and this is from a scholar of color at Emory University, Carol Anderson. Her recent book, White Rage, brilliant analysis of how right now what we're seeing, and she wrote it actually before the election, but she was very prescient in terms of what she foresaw, is that every era of progress for peoples of color, particularly black folks, has been met with this rage-filled pushback on the part of whites trying to reassert the past system, as in make America great again, right? I mean, it's like the perfect example. So by all means, I want you to buy my books because, they're here, and I sell them. But buy Carol Anderson's book, read Baldwin, read Angela Davis, read Bell Hooks, read Claude Steele. You know, there's a number of people, again, on my reading list who I reference because I want folks to look at that wisdom. And the third piece of accountability is financial give back. 25% of my fee goes back to the nonprofit organization with which I work that schedules those speeches, but they're not a traditional speakers bureau. They are an organization that does leadership development on campuses and in communities. 70% of the people in the organization and speakers in the organization and educators are folks of color. We do curriculum development, we do films, we do written materials that are intended to be anti-bias training or anti-oppression training materials. And we're able to do that because every one of us in that quote-unquote bureau, but really nonprofit group, gives back 25% of our fee. We could all keep that money, and we could pocket it and just do what we do, the folks of color and the white folks, but we don't because we support the mission of that organization. And so I think that both the financial give back, the professional, sharing of wisdom, and the recognition of pointing out people that I want people to listen to, when there are folks of color who come to your campus, it's really important that you show up in these or better numbers for them. That's another really important thing for people to do that I think sometimes we forget. And so I don't know that it ever makes for perfect accountability. I don't think there is such a thing. And every white person who does this work is going to screw up. Every man who tries to speak against sexism is going to screw up. When straight folks and cisgendered folks speak against straight supremacy and transphobia, we're going to make mistakes. But I think at the end of the day, those of us who have privilege, and we all have it in some area, every one of us has got some of it somewhere. If you're somebody who cares about poor folks and poverty, but you yourself are not poor, you shouldn't say to yourself, well, I'm not going to take up that fight because after all, I'm not poor. That doesn't make sense. We need folks to get involved in all of these struggles, race, class, gender, sexuality, as allies. Now, that does mean following, not trying to lead. And so I try to make sure that I'm following the lead of those folks of color whose work I reference, those communities of color, those organizations of color, like the People's Institute in New Orleans, which trained me, and others as well. Sometimes I do it well, sometimes I don't. But I think that's the task of all of us who are white and try to do the work with integrity.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Over here.
Hi, Tim. First, I'd like to start off with just saying thanks for coming to PCC. And my question is in regard to what has been going around lately is Asian privilege in respect to white privilege. As some people may or may not know, Asians are at the moment kind of out earning whites. They're better educated than whites, and socially, most likely they suffer or they have the same advantages that white people have in that. You're probably not going to look at an Asian person and think that they're a threat to society. They're probably not going to be profiled like blacks and other Hispanic.
It definitely depends.
But for the most part, Asians have been dubbed the model minority group.
Right.
And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. I was just wondering if Asians, they suffer from the same similar oppressions that blacks and other Hispanics do, as you mentioned in your talks. Internment camps,
right.
And the railroads, everything.
Right.
They suffer from oppression, racism, much like blacks and Hispanics. And I was just wondering if Asians, are doing well for the most part in America. How come blacks and Hispanics, in particular, and probably other minority groups, haven't quite caught up to Asians?
Okay, so this is really not too complicated, but it too requires a bit of a history piece. The notion of the model minority, first of all, we got to understand where this came from, right? Because when you understand the origin of it, you understand how cynical the argument is that you just shared. Not saying it's your argument, but it's one that gets made, and it's one that you've just brought up. The origin of that term literally traces back to 1961 and 1962, when three magazines in particular, U.S. News and World Report, Life magazine, and I think it was Look magazine, which was another magazine at that time that was very popular, all did these stories about either Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, or Japanese Americans. And they use this term, model minority, to suggest that, why can't black folks be more like this, right? Now, here's why it's a cynical argument. In 1961-62, the immigration restrictions that affected Asians hadn't even been lifted yet. But here you had these magazines saying, look how model they are, look how great they are. Why would they have done that in 61 and 62? Well, because that's the moment when the civil rights movement being led by black folks is in the street demanding an end to oppression. So you got these media folks who are basically saying, stop your whining and just work hard. So I think it's a very cynical argument, because at that moment we were still blocking Asians from coming into the country, and we were about to start bombing the hell out of Southeast Asia. We're about to kill about 3.5 million Vietnamese, Thai, Lao, Cambodian, and Hmong folks in the name of a war that we knew damn good and well didn't make sense. So I don't buy it when people say that, oh, look at these model minorities, because we killed a lot of them, even as we were saying that. Second point, the idea of Asians as this aggregate group that are doing well is statistically, historically, conceptually wrong. Certain Asian subgroups are indeed out-earning whites on a family and household basis. Others are most definitely not. Let's look at the ones that are. By and large, it's Korean Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, sometimes Chinese Americans, sometimes Filipinos, depending on the area. But here's the problem with that data. Oh, and subcontinental South Asian Indians, right? But here's the problem with that argument. Couple points. Number one, on average, since that's the phraseology you used as well, on average, they're better off than. On average, Asian households have 1 to 2 more people in them and 1 to 2 more earners in them. So in other words, if you got white households here with maybe 1 earner or maybe 2, and you might have an Asian household over here with 2 or 3 people in the family working, or maybe 4 people in the family working, the fact that this group is making more than that group is just a math game. But per capita, they're not making more. Per capita, they're making less. So in fact, they're not really better off, and they're earning relative to how many people are putting in effort, they're actually not doing very well. That's the first problem. The second problem is that 60% of all Asian and Pacific Islanders in this country live in 5 states, and I think we know what they are. They are Hawaii, they are California, they are New York, they are, I believe, Washington State and Illinois perhaps, or maybe DC, which is not a state obviously, but 5 areas, right? And the important thing about particularly California and Hawaii as the 2 biggest that represent alone about half of Asian Americans, 45 to 50% of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, is that those are states that compared to the rest of the country have higher average incomes. So if Asians are clustered in places with higher average incomes, then Asian households are going to have more money than white households and Latino households and black households that are spread around the country. In other words, it's like saying, yes, you're right, Japanese Americans in San Francisco make a lot more than white folks in Des Moines, Iowa. No shit, right? Of course they do. It's also more expensive to live in San Francisco than it is in Des Moines, Iowa. So when you disaggregate all of that data and you break it down at the local level, here's what you find. In Los Angeles County, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, even just the aggregate, let alone if we tease out the different groups, Asian American and Pacific Islander poverty in Los Angeles County is nearly double the rate of white poverty in Los Angeles County. The only reason it doesn't look that way nationwide is because it's aggregate data. When you actually look at the people in the same area, when you look at whites here, Asians here, they're not doing equally well. Chinese American professionals with college degrees earn currently 55% of what white professionals with college degrees earn. So A, they're not all doing that well. B, they're not in fact starting with the same opportunities. C, they're apparently still facing significant obstacles. And D, the whole history of this concept is rooted in an attempt, going back to the point of my lecture, of divide and conquer. Getting black folks to be mad at Asian folks to be mad at Latino folks, everybody to be mad at indigenous folk, and nobody is paying attention to the bigger issue, which is rich white folks who are screwing pretty much all of those groups that I just mentioned. So that's my answer to the question, and I appreciate you asking. Yes.
Hello. Am I speaking clearly?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay. So I wanted to I wanted to ask you on your opinion on what's been happening on college universities, campuses, particularly when other groups of other clubs that have different ideals than the ones expressed here today, when they try to get the opportunity to say their point of view, maybe bring in their own stance and statistics to back it up,
Sure.
they're shut down. And you see a lot of that happening in, for example, Berkeley and Amherst and DePaul, and it's just, it seems to be a very normal trend on college universities to silence speakers that they tend to disagree with, and a lot of it happens to be ideologically driven from what I've studied on it.
Sure.
And I believe that we come to a consensus on these issues if we allow all sides to speak, and within a public discourse, we filter out what is truthful and what isn't, and what is ideological, what isn't,
Sure.
and devoid of race and gender, because anybody can say something truthful, regardless of
Totally. Oh, yeah.
what
Of course.
what genitalia they have or what
Of
their
course.
color of their skin.
Of course.
And I just see a lot of this as being very divisive, and
Okay.
it categorizes people in terms of I'm brown, therefore I have been experiencing oppression by white Americans, and I disagree. I actually would like to say that I've seen my skin color as a privilege, because I have not been shouted down at. I've never been called, you're a white male. I've never been told these sorts of things. I've been told I'm a male, but not that I'm white. And I see that as a privilege, because if I were to say something truthful, it could easily be shot down because of the color of my skin or the whatever is dangling between my legs.
Well,
I
okay.
disagree with that.
I'm going to shoot down what you said. It has nothing to do with the color of your skin, though. Here's what I would say. First, I'm glad that you haven't been the subject of some type of invidious mistreatment on the basis of your skin color, or at least so long as you can tell or you're articulating, you're saying that you haven't been. And that's fabulous, and I hope that continues for you.
I'm not saying.
No, hold on. I hope that continues to be the case. I can assure you, if you believe that being shouted down as a white male somehow comports to or equates to the history of mistreatment of people with dark skin, which is a history you surely would not deny, and that somehow that's the real problem today is white men like Milo Yiannopoulos not getting to speak at Berkeley, that's the problem, not racial profiling, not people of color being treated as terrorists and suspected of terrorism because they're Muslim or from the so-called Middle East, not ICE raids on Latino folks, not folks who were brought here as children by their parents and are now being threatened with the potential of deportation, those folks who were the dreamers. If you think that being labeled a white man and somebody reminding white men that they're white men and shouting them down equates to that, then I really don't know how we can have much conversation. Having said that, the point about free speech, I agree with you on. I just want to make a few points about it, though, because I think it's important. First of all, free speech does not obligate an institution of higher learning to provide a platform for every opinion, whether it's as faculty or whether it's as a guest speaker. And we know that's true because I don't think this or very many schools, and I would suspect that you would not advocate that schools generally, let's say, have an obligation to bring in people who believe the earth is flat to challenge scientists who know that's not true. I don't think that most schools would feel obligated to bring in a Nazi who says that the Holocaust of European Jewry didn't happen, even though they're out there. And they certainly would not be required to offer that person a position in the history department or have the history department, even at a public school, give them space. So free speech means you can say whatever you want and we can't lock you up for it. That's what it means. We cannot arrest you. You cannot be punished in some sort of criminal justice sense for having said your piece. But that doesn't mean that institutions have to remain entirely neutral on certain subjects, particularly when they have mission statements that commit them to certain ideals, right? Mission statements that say, for instance, and I haven't read the one at PCC in many years, but I'm quite confident that like most colleges, it's very lovely, it's very, it's lifelong learners in a global environment. That's what we're trying to create. And it might even reference diversity, it might even reference equity. A lot of schools have missions that even mention social justice and all these things. And they adopted those missions as statements of their own values, just like Brigham Young University, as an LDS Mormon school, has the absolute right to not invite me, right? Because my views are completely in contradiction to the LDS faith, at least in part, I suppose, and they never invited me. But I don't get to scream oppression because BYU didn't bring me, or Jerry Falwell Jr. didn't bring me to Liberty University, or I never got invited to Hillsdale or Bob Jones University or anything like that. That doesn't mean that I don't respect the free speech rights of those folks. But I just want to make clear, free speech is not a requirement that someone else give you the mic. Right? It says, if Ann Coulter wants to write books that people buy, fantastic. Milo wants to write a book, and there was pressure to cancel Milo's contract, but that's called the free market. So they made the decision based on protest to pull the contract. That's the market. That's not oppression. And also, let's keep in mind what happened at Berkeley. Let's be very clear. At the first time Milo got canceled, the school had extended the invitation. The school did not try to censor him. The school did not say, you cannot come for ideological or any other reasons. There just so happened to be people unaffiliated with that institution who created a problem in downtown Berkeley.
Some of their teachers were involved in it, though.
There were a handful of people who were probably students, but the protest was not, the attempt to shut it down was not done by Berkeley itself. Berkeley extended the invitation. They were prepared to pay whatever the fee was going to be to the organization or whatever that sponsored it, and they were not going to shut him down. But here's what the professors who were protesting it said. Because there was a letter that was circulated by professors at Berkeley protesting his appearance, which is their free speech, by the way. Yeah. They send a letter around and they said, we do not oppose Milo Yiannopoulos coming to this campus because of his views, his conservatism, his support for Trump, or anything like it. The reason we are worried about this is because about a month and a half, I think it was earlier, he had been at, I believe it was the University of Chicago, but it might have been DePaul. It was a school in Chicago. And he got up on stage and in front of a pretty large crowd of people, puts a picture of a trans woman who is a student at that school on an overhead projector and proceeds to make fun of her for about 5 minutes. She's in the audience at the time. He is literally objectifying her in a way that endangers her in front of her students, making fun of her, not making a political argument about transgender identity. If he wants to stand up and say he doesn't think transgender is a thing, I can think he's an idiot, but he's entitled to that opinion. If he wants to stand up and say, quote unquote, look at that tranny, da-da-da-da-da, which is what he did, that's not an argument. That's not a political opinion. That's just verbal abuse. And it subjected this young woman to the possibility of further retaliation. And what the folks at Berkeley were saying is, this is an individual who has proven himself willing to subject the students at a school to harassment and even violence. We are worried he will do the same here. That is perfectly within Berkeley's rights to say, we have an obligation to protect our community from people who would endanger members of our community whom we are legally and morally obligated to protect. That's a different thing than free speech.
With Milo Yiannopoulos, I agree specifically with that case. Okay. However, there's other professors such as Christina Hoff Sommers, who has a YouTube channel called The Factual Feminist. She identifies as a feminist. She does not agree on a lot of their a lot of the issues.
And she speaks all around this country and has for 25 years.
And she has had riots and people very
I had white supremacists show up and try to start a riot in Indiana when I was speaking. It happened.
True, but she had a difference of opinion, and she was therefore not toting the party line. And
she gets speaking engagements for the last 25 years. She's done as many as I have. She's had book deals that are far more lucrative than I have. She's been on television. She gets her viewpoint heard all the time. And by the way, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. These people you're talking about, Ann Coulter, all these folks have best-selling books. They speak all over the country. They have folks who subsidize their lecture tours. It's not like conservatives can't get heard in this country.
Oh, I'm not saying conservatives particularly. I'm just saying people who have a difference of opinion. I was just saying someone who has a difference of opinion. And you see a lot of times those people are not allowed to speak. If they say a point, then they're disregarded by a lot of people.
Well, I don't think they should be shouted down. I don't believe in a heckler's veto. I don't believe in shouting people down, and I've never done that. So I guess my point is, the points that you're making about letting people express themselves and not shouting them down or shutting them down, we are in agreement. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there's this mythology of victimhood that the right has created that says we can't get our views heard, even though we have all these folks on talk radio, we have all these folks on the lecture circuit, we have all these folks on television, we have all these folks with book deals. They get heard often, and I don't have any problem with that, but I do think that colleges have the right, whether they are BYU or even a public institution, to say we have a certain set of values, and we believe that certain people may, by virtue of their opinion, actually violate and abuse those values. Now, that's not most conservatives, by the way, but there are certainly
Tim?
people who are like that. Richard Spencer, the white nationalist, is someone who I don't think has any reason to be on a college campus, because everything he says about the need for white people to control this country and have it all to ourselves is in violation of every school of education's mission statement. And I think any school has the right to say, nah, you're not coming here. You have the right to stand on the corner and do that. You can start your own college if you like. You can write a book, and if anybody wants to buy it, great. You can put your stuff on the internet. But this institution is not duty-bound to give a Nazi a platform just because there's free speech in America. That's
Tim?
not what free speech is.
Tim, we're going to move on to our next question.
Thank you.
Well, that was intense. So,
Go ahead.
yeah, the situation, it was, I was with this 11-year-old boy who I visited, and I knew him since he was like very little, and he would always speak of how much he misses Mexico. And now he is 11, and I remember that, and I asked him, hey, do you want to go to Mexico? Do you miss that place? And his answer, like, it was, I didn't had it coming. He just says, no, like, why should I go? Like, that place is garbage. It's a trash.
Right.
So, like, not only he insulted the place, he insulted the place where I spent most of my life.
Right.
And I had the opportunity to see beautifully.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking, like, his environment is black-brown. So this kid is growing up believing that his own roots are garbage.
Yeah.
And what it makes me think is what is going to happen with kids. Eventually, those kids will have to grow up, and
Right.
they will remain those ideas in their head.
Yeah.
So what can we do as a society with kids? Because if they're getting through kids' mind, like, very hardly they will get it off when they grow up.
Right. Well, I think the phenomenon that you're speaking to is a very common one. Whenever people are marginalized in any society, this isn't just America and the U.S. of America, and it's not just about race. People who are marginalized often internalize a degree of oppression against their own group, because if you're subjected to hostility or negative images of your group, after a while, it's like any kind of advertising, right? Advertising works because people put the images out, you see them over and over, and then you start buying their product. And if their product is self-hatred, don't be surprised when some folks buy it too. That can happen to women who have negative opinions about other women. There's actually research which finds that women are actually harder on women who are applying for jobs where they're the one doing the evaluation than men are. So I mean, what's that about? It's about the internalization of the idea, at least to some extent, that men are somehow better, right? So it happens across the board to any group that's been targeted.
Does people actually know that that is a problem with kids? That is something going on to, like, try to like, improve it?
Right. Well, the thing that I would say that we can do to get at that, because it's a very common thing, is we've got to make sure that people are being given a different lens through which to understand their world than the one they're currently given. And so, for instance, a couple years ago, there was an amazing program. It's now been shelved by the Arizona legislature, but in the Tucson Unified School District, there was an amazing program, La Raza Studies. It was a Mexican-American studies program. It was optional. You didn't have to enroll in it when you were in the high school, but it was open to people, and it was open to everybody. It wasn't just Chicano kids or larger Latinx community kids. The idea was, we want to have the curriculum of the school done through a lens of the Mexican-American experience, whether that's the literature, science class, history class, all of that. We're still going to teach all those subjects, but we're just going to use a different framework, right? And this program, and I worked with some of the educators, brilliant teachers, met a lot of the students in the class, and what was happening was, after several years of this program, the research was done and found that 75% of the Latinx kids, mostly Chicano kids, who came through that program were going on to college. And of the Latinx and mostly Chicano kids who didn't go through that program, who just did the regular program, which had a much whiter kind of lens and sort of generic lens, I suppose. Not generic, really quite white, but they said it was generic. Only 17% of those kids were going on to college. And they were from the same neighborhoods. They were from the same community. They had parents that were similar economically, culturally. So what was happening? You had this group of Chicano kids over here who were on fire for learning because the learning had been made relevant to their day-to-day experience, and they had this understanding that academic success was not white, it was not European, it was not for rich people, it was for them. And they had a whole history of success and involvement in the struggle to make things better in their countries of origin and also here that they needed to understand. We've seen the same results with work that talks about the African American experience, indigenous experience. So unfortunately, the Arizona lawmakers killed this program. And they killed it because they said, it's breeding hatred for white people. Well, it was just teaching the truth of history. That's all. It wasn't breeding hate. It's an accurate reflection of history. And first of all, a lot of the kids and their families knew that this stuff had happened. It's not like folks don't know how half of Mexico got stolen, right? But they just needed it to be ratified in the classroom. It's nice to hear that you're not crazy, that actually what you think happened is really sort of what went down. And so what's been happening since is, of course, some of the students and some of the educators have been fighting to get the program back in. And there are certain elements that have sort of gotten mixed back in, but not formally so, last time I checked in and heard. But here's what they have been doing and what is really important. We don't have to wait for the schools to do right by those kids. We can start doing that. We can do that as parents. We can do that in the community. The thing is, if we sit around, because I don't really trust the schools to do it. If I was a Chicano parent in Tucson, I wouldn't be sitting around trusting the state to do right. They've been doing wrong all that time. But I tell you what, we got a community center, and I got a recreation room, or I got a garage, and we can get kids in there on the weekends and all through the summer, and we'll teach them that stuff. And we can do that at any time. So I think that's what we have to do. I am sorry about that. I would have stayed all night, but I'm being told we got to go. Go ahead.
Yeah, this relates to activism, and I wanted to just reference Baldwin for a minute. I just finished reading The Fire Next Time.
Yeah.
Amazing, really opened up a lot for me. One of the things he said, because I've thought a lot about this idea of freedom. Americans are always talking about freedom, and the disconnect of the reality of that and the fact that we have more people incarcerated than any other country in the world.
Right.
But we're always talking about we're going to war for freedom, we're doing this and that for freedom. Mm-hmm. And Baldwin said, Americans aren't so concerned about freedom, but superiority. I'm paraphrasing.
Sure.
So that really opened that up for me because it's like kind of some kind of play on words that we're doing with ourselves.
Right.
And so how do we break through as activists? I feel like a lot of people in the, I hate the terms liberal and conservative, but on the left are constantly preaching to the choir. We're constantly like surrounding ourselves with people who agree with us, people who validate us, and we don't have the patience to talk to the other side. We don't have the ability to hear Trump supporters. We don't have the ability to reason with them, and I think it's part of the failure of the Democratic Party, perhaps part of the failure of the left to be an effective voice. And so what I've started to do is I start, like, for instance, going on Breitbart News, going onto some of the sites that advertise on there, like this white Europa site where they have actually articles about race and trying to, like, how are these people getting these points of views? And just to hear, do you see value in that as an activist to be able to see through the lens of people who are supporting the system?
Sure. Here's the thing, right? We all do this. This isn't a left thing or a liberal thing. Everybody in this culture nowadays overwhelmingly does a little bit of this siloing, right? Where we're all in our silo. So people on the left, we create our silos on social media, absolutely. We create our silos in our communities, who we communicate with, what websites we read, what TV shows we watch, et cetera. And conservative folks do a very similar thing. Folks on the right don't read our books, and we don't read theirs overwhelmingly. They don't read our websites, and we don't read theirs. So we could all do a lot to sort of broaden our understanding of what the other side thinks, because it will help, and I certainly learned this in my own experience, forcing myself to read prominent conservative authors and even far, far, far right authors to get a better sense of what my own values and what my own beliefs were.
Yeah.
So I think there's value in it. But here is the other point, and this is the part where it gets a little tricky. The premise sometimes in that idea that I want to get to understand you and then you get to understand me so we can sort of get to the truth of what facts are and how we come to understand certain facts is that what the research is showing us, and this is a little bit distressing, but I think we can work with it, is that facts aren't actually why we believe what we believe. Now, this is shocking to people. Most people want to believe, whether they're on the left like I am or whether they're on the right, or whether they're somewhere in between, that the reason they think what they think is because they've honestly considered all the issues and the arguments, and they've come to their rational, objective conclusion. And what the research from social science tells us, mostly brain science research and social psychology and linguistics, is that we don't really come to conclusions based on that. And we know that because no one in here has read everything there is to read before you came to your conclusion on subject A or subject B. I certainly haven't. And I've read thousands of books on race, but there's stuff I don't know. And I'm learning new stuff all the time, and I'm open to admitting that. But what we do base our opinions on is usually a combination of things. Number one, of course, has to do with our upbringing and the values we were taught and the ideas we were given in the home. Number two, the peer groups that we hung out with from really an early age and what influence they might have had. Other environmental things that we were exposed to growing up. And even, here's the frightening part, some of it's possibly even biological. Like there's actually some evidence that there are some biological and even possibly genetic things that predispose people to a quote unquote, even though like you said, this is not great terminology, conservative worldview versus liberal worldview. So how do you deal with that? Well, it's hard because it means that a lot of people are going to engage in what they call epistemic closure, right? Where you just sort of, you have your worldview and you close yourself off to others, or confirmation bias where you just seek out things that confirm what you already think. The one thing that appears to make a difference in some of the research that's been done, and certainly in my own personal experience, is approaching those people who are on the other side less with a bunch of facts and data and more with narrative and with story. One of the reasons that I told several stories today, the story about my drug use thing and the car, the story about my kid, right? And there were others that I told sort of indirectly, minor stories. And I do a lot of other stories as well in other speeches, is because I know that those are the things that actually stick with folks. Like I threw out some data too, but mostly I did stories and historical analysis because the data doesn't stick with us. And sometimes if you have an incentive to ignore my data, you're just gonna turn it off. But when I tell that story about how I was treated by that cop, it's really hard for a rational person to act like that story doesn't mean anything. Or when I talk about how I explain this thing to my kid in relation to the history, that's a story that people will remember more so maybe than the history itself. And so narrative is an important way. When I sit down, I've been having a long conversation via email with a guy who I refer to as my Nazi pen pal. Now, I do not recommend having one of these, and I don't recommend seeking one out. No, don't seek it out. But I didn't seek him out. He sought me out. And when we started, he wasn't a pal at all. He wrote me very hostile several years, 8, 9 years ago. And I just decided that day I'm going to try something different with this guy. Because I get that from white supremacists a lot. And sometimes I just ignore it. Sometimes I fire back if I'm in a pissy mood, which is not a good idea. But, you know, we're humans. We do that. But this time I was like, I'm going to try an experiment. And my experiment was, I wrote him back and I said, you know, Rob, it seems to me like you're having sort of a bad day. And I said, I've had those. I know what that is. It was a Friday. I said, tell you what, think about it over the weekend. And if on Monday you still want to talk, hit me up and we'll talk. And I knew there were 3 possibilities. He just would ignore it, in which case we're done. He would fire back with, you know, screw you, Jew, or whatever. And in which case we're also done. And at least I tried, right? Or he could respond with kindness because I showed him some. And oddly enough, he writes me back almost immediately, within an hour, and he says, you know, I'll write you on Monday. Thanks. Thanks for being kind. And I'm like, okay. So he writes me on Monday. And so now look, I'm not going to lie to you and say that I have flipped this Nazi from being, I mean, and when I say Nazi, I'm not trying to use that like for effect. Like he'll tell you that's pretty much what he is. He prefers the term white nationalist, but he doesn't flinch from the term Nazi. And I'm not telling you that we're all like good now and we hang out and I'm inviting him to Thanksgiving, because that is not going to happen. But here's the thing. The anger level has diminished. His willingness to engage with some of my thoughts has grown. He's not in the same hostile, like 8 years ago, he was dangerous. He was truly dangerous. And right now, I think he's just a dude trying to get through life, and he's got a messed up ideology, but I don't think he's dangerous. He sends me yoga poses now. I don't even do yoga, but he's like, really, try this one. I'm like, okay. He's like, you need to get a recumbent bike. It's awesome. I'm like, okay. He sends recipes. I ask him about his kid. It's weird. It's creepy. But here's the thing. Like, he's been defanged a little bit. He's not the same guy that he was. And I know at least 5, maybe 7 or 8 former white supremacists who have come out of the movement. I'm talking about overt white supremacists, Nazis. And I know 5, 6, 7 of them who have come out of the movement and now speak out against the movement and do anti-racism work, some of it really great work. And every single one of them has a story about how that happened, and every single one of those stories is about somebody demonstrating some kindness to them that they didn't expect and how that changed them. Now, here's a really important point. I do not ask black and brown folks to waste even 1 second of your lives trying to do that work with overt racists. That's on me and my people. That's our burden to bear. People of color have got more than enough. I'm not asking any black person to, hey, reach out to a Nazi today and let me know how it goes. I know that's a bad idea. But white folks, we got to come for our people. Whether they're overt haters or whether those people somewhere in the middle, that's our struggle. That's our burden. We have to take it up. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Oh, there you go.
As an African American, I know that we know a lot about other races. We read about it, we had to, it's in the history books. We had to study our history book on our own. And the other races didn't study us. If they studied us, they would care more, and Baki wouldn't have asked to be considered affirmative action when he was white. They say that affirmative action was for black people who gave them the #1 spot and they weren't qualified. That was not true. So I read a lot, and I'm in white America, African America, Jewish America. I belong to an organization in San Marino, Sierra Madre, and I learned everything. Cucamonga, I was the president of a Cucamonga club, and that's all white. I was only African American there. And my son and I, we go into white areas. He joined the Redondo Beach Chamber of Commerce when he was 26. No black was in Redondo Beach. Oh, no. He didn't even live there. So I'm just saying, I guess he learned after me, go where you think you're not wanted. I got in the Sierra Madre choir. I can sing, I'm a musician anyway. So I became the pianist of the Sierra Madre choir, second pianist. So I'm just saying, if the white would go into our world, and we have to code, we have to speak 3 languages. We know how to do the handshake. And we know how to say, shake your hand, but they don't know how to do all that. So we know more than they know. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So thank you, everybody, for being here. We are going to switch things around a little bit. Mr. White is going to be in the back of the room signing books. So if anyone is interested in purchasing a copy of the book, we'll be in that back corner. If for any reason there is anyone who has not signed in yet, that's all available there. And please grab lots of food. Thank you for being here.